you motivate native plants. So often we're in a race to do it, right? We're ready to do it. But there's a few things that we should consider before you get started. Okay, so let's talk about native plants and what you find. So this is what we're used to seeing here on the left in the garden centers. Often we're seeing plants that are flowering already, very beautiful, pretty much manipulating you into buying them, smelling really good. You know, I can smell that stuff, this plant right there. Um, yeah, I'm like, hyacinth, what is it again? Yeah, so the opposite on the native plants. The best time to plant native plants is during times when they're more dormant, right? So in the early spring, in the fall, and that's when they don't really look like anything. So they're not really looking like, hey, buy me. They look more like what you see on the right, which is twigs and leaves. So a lot of times people aren't as, they don't really know what to do when they're looking and shopping at a native plant nursery. So it's important that you do a lot of research prior to putting in your native garden. And we're going to talk about that kind of research. Next page. Okay, so one of those things is understanding where your plants come from. Okay, that's a really, really big deal. So you'll hear, oh, this is native, or you'll go to a garden center and it'll say native plant. Well, your next question is native to where? And that even applies locally down to if we find it in one part of Prince William County and not in another part of Prince William County. One thing is plants don't care about those political lines, what county they're in. That part doesn't matter, but it does matter where they are located, where they have evolved. So you see where we see coastal plain. Part of Prince William County is in the coastal plain. It's along the edge where we're getting a lot more water. Their water table is higher, and different types of plants occur there. And then we're also Piedmont. And in Piedmont, we're going to find different plants that we're finding on the coastal area. And that really matters when you're trying to put plants together. So often people will get the impression that, you know, native plants, they're from here, so they know how to grow in the gardens that they're in. And if I just throw them in the ground, it's going to work out. But if they're not actually used to the conditions that you're giving them, that may not be the appropriate plant. Okay, so one of the first things you want to do is plan out your garden, okay? After you've done your research and you figure out, where does this plant occur, okay? You have to make a good plan. And knowing how that plant is going to react or what you can expect from that plant is really important. And that kind of went into the research of it. So let's say, for example, you want a meadow in your landscape. Well, meadows, the plants that are in meadows are usually the most competitive of the plants. They're the showiest, the tall, the most aromatic. And that's because they want to be pollinated so they can go to seed. And that also means that they might be a little bit wild within your garden. And you may not be ready for what's about to happen when you put them in there. So planning it out is really, really important. And whether you make the plan yourself or you contact some of those free resources that are available to help you. For example, the Master Gardeners can support you on that when you have questions. You can call the Master Gardeners. Plant Nova Natives is a really, really great resource for native plants to figure out, you know, how to manage or what kind of plants to get, etc. There's also local designers, and not a lot of people know this. We do exist. So aside from me, in fact, Nancy, who has Gentle Landscaping, she's across the street, across the hall from us. Adrian, who has Be American, he's also running around here somewhere. So, you know, there's opportunities to work with people who are professionals that know how to do this. But if you're doing it yourself, there's also resources for that. Okay. So here's the thing. If you start off like this, you can't just put native plants into this. It's really important to understand. So what we're seeing over here on the left, where it says before, and we have all these invasive plants in here, these plants have taken over. These plants are not from this area. They're not from this country. Okay. And so they've taken over the area and they're not allowing native plants to grow. And that's why they are invasive. So if you have this in your garden, you can't just put native plants in there and expect them to thrive. you're gonna have to do some management. So here, this property is in Manassas City. And what we've done here is we had to take out Creeping Charlie, English Ivy, Vinca, and some other stuff. It was a whole big job, and managing it over time because you've got those seeds in the seed bank as well. And then after you get out the invasive part, then you can start to add in natives, but you can't do it prior to, okay? You have to manage that part first or nothing will grow. Okay, that's my kid, by the way. That's the youngest one. So the big question is, where do you get native plants? You know, who's closer to you? Lowe's, Home Depot, you know what I mean? You're not going to find plants like that there. You may get lucky here and there, but you have to know where to find the natives. So there are opportunities to get free plants online. There's native plant swaps. I would say the pros and cons to that is you're kind of relying upon the person to know what they're talking about. So let's say they have a plant that's like a cultivar and they don't know it, you know what I mean? Then you have a plant that has been changed rather than having a straight species. So it kind of gets tough on that part, but you can find some people who know what they're talking about that can exchange plants with you. And then there's the seasonal plant sales. So the Master Gardeners do a seasonal plant sale. The Native Plant Society in Prince William has one as well. And at the Bluebell Festival, which hopefully most of us will be at, very fun. There'll be native plants there as well. But you could also purchase seeds and plants locally. Green Steeze also ships and delivers those. I know Be American was doing plants last year. I think he's going to pick up next year. And then other places like Earth Sangha, which is where we are here. That's in Springfield. And then Watermark Woods is over in Loudoun County, and they do retail sales of native plants as well. So sometimes it can be tough to find. You're not just going to find them in the garden center, but they are available. And if you ever have questions, I know that you could at least reach out to us. You can reach out to Extension, reach out to Plant Nova Natives and find resources. Okay. Was there a question? We're going to get to those? Okay. Okay, great. Okay. So soil preparation, we got to talk about this. It's really important. Okay. So everybody kind of starts off in a different scenario. So some of you guys might be starting off with all those invasive plants that you got to remove. And when you're removing those, it's usually very soil disruptive. Okay. And then sometimes it's turf grass that you got to get rid of before you can put native plants in. Or sometimes in this case over here, it was Bermuda grass. That was fun. So there's different techniques to managing how you manage the soils in your yard. The thing is, we're trying to mimic native conditions, and that can be a challenge. You have to know where that plant came from. So here on the left, we are showing smothering, which is we're using a very thick, it's like a 6 milliliter plastic, and it's strategically put in pretty much the whole summer long. And so it takes about 4 months sometimes to kill off the things that are underneath it. And you're utilizing that nice heat that we get in the summertime, and then so that it's ready to plant in the fall. That's an option for you. Another way to do this is to use, you could use newspaper, a couple of layers of newspaper if you're covering turf. And then you can make sure that you have about 6 inches between compost and mulch to kind of kill what's underneath it. That will work for some things. It will not work for perennial species that are invasive, like English ivy. You can't just cover that. Vinca, you can't just cover that. Some things have to be dug out. But for things like turf grasses, stuff like that, you can smother those pretty easily. Now, the pros to smothering turf grass is that when you kill off that grass, that becomes a nitrogen source for your plants, and you're not disrupting the soil. The more you dig into that soil, the worse it is for your plants, because your plants actually need that good ecosystem that's happening in the soil. And every time we go digging in it, it's kind of like we just threw a bomb on someone's house. You know what I mean? And so they're not able to kind of provide the nutrients and things that are needed for those plants to grow. So we often think that you need a green thumb, you need to be good at growing plants, but it's actually more of the soil has to be appropriate for the plants in order for them to grow. Okay, so on this side, what we're demonstrating, we've papered this whole area and we put down compost, and then this stage is mulching. Okay. So when we're planting, I know you guys have probably seen this before. If you've ever gotten anything from a garden center, you usually see that the roots are pretty wrapped up. Before you can plant in the ground, you're going to have to untangle that, because often if you stick them in the ground just like that, not only is the soil that they're holding onto just a little bit easier for them to hold onto, which doesn't encourage them to put out root growth, but they're wrapped up so tightly that they can't put out the new growth, and it's not healthy for the plant. We've actually found dead or sometimes living plants that are still wrapped up in this circle of roots, and you go to dig it out and it's just like a big plop that comes out, and it's been in there for years and just never gravitated to the soil. Another thing that I run into all the time is with these burlap wrapped trees, okay? And I just saw one yesterday, actually. Metal still intact in the ground, where they literally just plop it in the ground, just like this. So this isn't good. So the common misconception is that, well, the burlap wrap will break down over time. But in actuality, it's a long time. It takes a really, really long time. So by the time it does break down, often these roots have died because they can't get out of there. So if you plop them in the ground, and then if you plop them in too deeply, that's going to be the end of this tree. I can't tell you how many dead trees I've dug out that are just like burlap wrapped. And some companies actually, when they install them, they require that you keep that on there in order to have their warranty. And yeah, it's kind of, I don't get it. But that's definitely not good for the tree. Okay, so I get this all the time. Everyone's like, I want to plant a tree. Usually it's a school. I want to plant a tree. And then it's just nothing but turf grasses, and they want to put the tree directly in the grass. Here's the thing. Trees and grass don't occur together. Turf grasses are non-native. They do not occur together. And usually one's going to be the winner. So if it's a mature tree, usually the tree is going to win. If the tree is young and you're sticking it in mature turf, usually the turf's going to win. So they're competing for the same resources. They're not going to be happy together. And in order to make them grow together, you really got to throw down like a lot of fertilizer and stuff. And it's not good for either party. So kind of pick and choose. Who do I want? Do I want the tree or do I want the turf? Pick the tree. So also when we're planting, you see here, this is the ground level and this is the root collar, okay? The root collar should be above the ground level. And often we put the tree down really deeply because they think that the roots need to go really, really deeply into the ground. But that's not the case. The tree has to spread its roots out laterally to hold onto the ground and be balanced. If you put it in too deeply, it's definitely going to die. So I can't tell you how many times I've run into the scenario where the tree has been planted too deeply and then we see the roots going like this. Should tree roots be growing upward? No. Okay. So that's really important when putting trees in. So everybody has different opinions about mulch and what would be considered good or bad. So let's talk about what the natural mulch is. So the tree has already done the job, the hard job of growing leaves all year, and then it drops its leaves, and that is the mulch. That is the natural mulch. However, often people look and see, and they're like, I don't like all these leaves, and they remove the leaves. And so when you remove those leaves, you're removing the organic matter that is going to be added to the soil. So now you have to replace it, and that's what mulch is for. So when you remove its natural mulch, then you have to put down some type of alternative. Now that could be different things. So some people like living plants as mulch, meaning it had some plants that were tall enough that in the fall, all their debris kind of drops down and that becomes the mulch on the ground. Or you could use like a hardwood shredded mulch or something like that, but you want to cover the bare soil. And it's important to cover the bare soil because basically in a nutshell, nature's band-aids will come in. If that soil is bare, something's going to cover it. And usually it's going to be an invasive plant rather than something cool that you want. So it's really important to make sure that the ground is not too bare. Now, just to throw, monkey wrench in there, bare soil is kind of good for bees. So you might want to leave a little bit, but if you leave a whole lot, you're going to have a big job to do when it comes to invasive removal. Now, what we see all the time here, you see this volcano mulching, all right? This deteriorates the trunk of the tree, and the tree also really can't breathe. Okay, it's really not a good thing. So you want to mulch the ground and not the tree trunk itself. So you see that root flare that we were talking about before? That should be above the ground rather than under the mulch. Okay, so watering is a really tricky thing to teach. And with new gardeners, and I remember it being tricky for me in the very beginning when I was just trying to figure out what to do. Um, it's hard to say how much water you need, and it's always going to be different per garden because everybody's in a different environment, a different microclimate. Okay, so the important thing is if I stick my finger in an inch in the soil, is it moist? And if it's not, if it's really dry, then it probably needs water. Okay. When it comes to native plants, typically we don't have to water them after they've become established, which means that once they've put their roots in really good, often they're very drought tolerant. But we have been having some scenarios this past season where we've seen more drought than we normally see. So for example, last spring where I usually install plants, I had to say, nope, let's push it to the fall because I don't want your plants to die. So if you're putting new plants in and you're not getting the type of rainfall that we would normally get, which is about an inch of water per week, then it's not going to be a good idea to plant, or you're going to have to go out there and do supplemental watering. And that means that you're watering instead of nature, which is opposite of what we want it to do. So we don't want to be out there watering the garden all the time. The rainwater should take care of it. So the only time you should really be out there watering is when you first install the plants and if you're not getting 1 inch of water per week. Does that make sense? Hopefully. You want your plants, so the question was if the plants are really established, like they've been in there for quite some time, do we need to water them if there's drought? Typically, the answer to that is going to be no, because your plants should be well established to the environment. However, the environment is changing. So it's a tough question because do you babysit them or do you kind of hope that they're more drought tolerant? For me, I wouldn't babysit them. I'd just hope they're more drought tolerant. You know, just kind of make them go through it and see if they make it, which they should if they're well established. All right. So our friend the deer. Okay, so everybody has different relationships or different opinions about the deer. Supervisor Angry, he actually showed up at me one day when I was luring a deer to one side of the yard with an apple. Um, you know, the deer they can be pretty detrimental to new plants. And so when you put new plantings in, it is kind of important to protect them if you know that there's deer around. Now, everybody wants to ask me, what's the deer resistant plant? There's almost no such thing as a deer resistant plant. It just depends on how hungry the deer are in your community. So if they're really, really hungry, they're going to try anything. There are some plants where I'm like, I know they're going to try this one. You know what I mean? There is a few that are deer candy. But in this scenario here, this is demonstrating an install that we did in a backyard. We actually did a clover lawn. Now, this is white clover. It is a non-native, but it is considered a naturalized plant. We did a clover lawn because the deer really like clover. The deer like it, the rabbits like it, etc. So that gives them something to graze that just keeps growing back instead of them focusing on how to get the new plants that we just put in. And then we protected those plants. Those plants have to be protected until they get big enough for the deer not to kind of eat them down. You know, that part's really important. So once your plants are very much established, even if they come and nibble on it, it usually should not kill the plant, but you have to get to that point. So when the plant is brand new, you definitely have to protect it. All right. So what I'm trying to show here is that the intention, okay? So if you put borders in and you have a wild garden, it's a lot easier for your neighbors to understand that this is on purpose. So they're not used to seeing they're not used to seeing what native plants often can look like, especially like if you have a wild garden. So if you're not out there like trimming everything all the time and stuff like that, then your garden might get a little bit wild looking. And you want your neighbors to know that you just didn't neglect a space. So putting in borders is kind of important. Also, even if you have like signage in your yard, sometimes that's helpful to communicate. We're going to dig into that thought a little bit more soon, a couple slides in. All right, so when you first plant your native plant garden, actually this is pretty impressive. I will say this is pretty impressive for a new planting, and only because these are very mature plants. Sometimes the only plants that you can get are like, when it comes to native plants, like little tiny things. So when you first put them in, they don't look like anything. You know, they just look like there might be weeds there. You know what I mean? People don't really know what's happening here. So in the process, especially in a public area, this is also Manassas City, and this is a very public area. You have to like put some signs, make sure people understand what's going on. But this turned into that I think in about a year. But these plants, they started off at least 1 gallon. So if you're starting off smaller than that, if you have like quart sizes and stuff like that, it's going to take a while before it turns into anything, before it looks like something. So often people get a little bit upset because they're used to instant gratification, right? So if I go to Lowe's and I get a 1 gallon plant, I know what to expect, and it's flowering already. What's wrong with my plant? You know, it's nothing wrong with it. It just has to establish its roots first. Now, the plants that come from the meadows, those are going to be the ones that are kind of going to take off faster, because their goal is to make seeds. So they want to go to flower. So they're going to send that energy into making more flowers to get pollinated, to make more seeds. But a lot of the perennials and shade gardens and stuff like that, they take a while to get going. So often people are like, you know, what kind of ground cover can I use? And I'm like, yeah, we have beautiful ground covers in shade, but they're not instant, you know? So that's where unfortunately, a lot of gardeners gravitate to like Vinca minor, which is periwinkle, English ivy, stuff like that, because they want to cover an area really quickly for instant gratification, or they're trying to like do a soil erosion project, but there's better ways of doing that, okay? So you want to gear away from those types of plants and just understand that your plants are going to take about 3 to 4 years to become established, to start spreading themselves, and especially when you're talking about shade plants. Okay, so let's talk. This is important. This is an important conversation, okay? So this is about what your neighbors see versus in your HOA versus what you see, okay? So the reason we use native plants is because we understand what they do. It's not necessarily because we were like, oh, that was prettier than the zinnia. You know what I mean? It's just that we understand the concept between planting a native plant, it hosting insects, it's supporting the environment, right? So when we're looking into our garden, this is what we see, okay? Bugs getting down, making new generations of themselves, and beautiful flowers and stuff. We're zoned into it, right? But then our neighbors see this, okay? Our neighbors see a mess. And so we want to be really careful about how we're communicating what native plants look like. So that research of figuring out, okay, how big does this plant get? That part's really important. But also, like, how do I manage this plant? Okay. So a good little technique is, if you're in the front yard and you've got a messy plant, or what others would consider messy, a good little technique you could use is just Chelsea chopping. And that's like what you do between after Mother's Day and before Father's Day. If it gets to the height you're comfortable with, just give it a little chop if it's herbaceous, and it'll usually flower right there and stop putting its energy towards growing tall. And that can help. I have some black-eyed Susans that came up in an area that's like next to a sidewalk where you really don't want tall plants, but I really like the plant. So I just chop it down to this, and they still flower right there, just really short on the ground. And you're not really hurting the plant per se. You're making it put energy into something else. So you're changing it slightly. But you don't want your neighbors to see a mess, because if they see a mess, they're going to think that native plants are messy and they're weedy, and we're not going to use them. Therefore, we're going to use these foreign plants that are not really supporting the environment. So what they see is really, really important. Now, HOAs are often not down for native plants, okay? I have some HOAs that are amazing, by the way. They're really on it, but it takes like the board already like being okay with it, understanding the concept, and like convincing the community. However, most HOAs are like, I want to see grass, and it needs to be at this height. And, you know, sometimes they consider plants an object. and your object can't be like more than 12 inches. I mean, there's a lot of rules and regulations. So you have to know your HOA's regulations and then work within those guidelines, right? So let's say that you want a plant that's 3 feet tall, but they only allow you 1 foot. Okay, just give it a little chop and make it a 1 foot plant. You know what I mean? But you also have to be careful because think about like, let's say that, you know, this year I injured my shoulder and my shoulder is not feeling great and I can't go out there and do the chopping the way that I want to. You gotta have a plan because that means they're gonna see what this plant turns into. Okay, so being really conscious of that. I would not encourage going cultivars. Okay, so a lot of times people were like, okay, I want this plant, but I want it to grow smaller, right? So for example, I got a Joe Pye weed and I don't want the Joe Pye weed to be this big. I'm gonna get the one that's smaller. I was just talking to a gentleman today who was talking about how there was a lot less pollinators on the one that he bought that was smaller. So cultivars are plants that we have changed for a reason to support our landscape or to support our vision of what we want the landscape to be, but we're changing it to the point where it could change its relationship with pollinators and the animals that are using it. Okay, so we have to be very careful about that. Another thing is if you use something that we've genetically changed, you're also changing the genetics of the wild plants in the area. So that's why we want to go straight species versus cultivars. But there is the scenario every now and then that it comes up, right? So I would say where I break that rule is like I really like pawpaws that are cultivars. They taste better. I'm sorry, they taste better. But it's about the use, right? So if I'm in a space where a lot of wild pawpaws are, I'm not gonna add in a cultivar because I know that I could be changing it. But let's say it's my home orchard and we're not in a coastal area. There's not pawpaws all over the place, right? Okay, my home orchard, I'm gonna pick the one that tastes good. You know what I mean? And that's what we do with food. Like that's literally where our vegetables and fruits come from, of us changing things. But when you're talking wild plant gardens, it's important to not change the plant if you can't, or if you don't have to. All right. If you ever run into the scenario where you're trying to comply with your HOA, but it's like not working out too well, just reach out. I'm pretty good at HOAs. Okay, so this is I think at this point, this was 6 years old. So all of these plants started off really, really small. I think a lot of them came from Sangha. They were probably like quart sizes. And so this is how long it took to get to this point. This is a wild garden, nothing chopped. So just to kind of give you an idea of how big the plants get and how long it takes them to get to that point. Okay. Some plants, they're going to get really big very quickly, and then others will take a while. Okay, so I like to leave a lot of time for Q&A, because usually that's the part that we all want to hear about. And I've left resources here for you to check out other things that Green Steeze does.
I'm in the chat already.
Okay. How much time we got? I'm so good at that. Let's talk. Okay. So we're getting into Q&A.
You want to repeat the question?
Sure.
How to deal with old silver maples and clay filter beds?
Huh?
Maybe how do you deal with old silver maples and the clay filler dirt? Sorry.
Oh, and clay filler. I'm not sure what they mean by that. What do you mean deal with them? Yeah, it's
Marty, post if you'd like to maybe rephrase your question and we'll get back to it. Okay. Yes.
I do. I've got here.
okay. You just tell me where to go.
I'd like to get these ones done first, just since those people aren't in the room to ask afterwards. But this one's a long one.
Let me try to address the clay filler thing. So okay, when developing, a lot of the topsoil is removed because topsoil has a lot of organic matter in it, and organic matter breaks down. So if you think about, you want a solid foundation, You don't want things breaking down under it. So a lot of times that's removed and the soil is compacted and you're left with subsoil, which is the clay. And it's compacted really, really, really tight to keep your house tight. Unfortunately, it's not just the foundation, like it's typically your whole lot. And then they don't bring the topsoil back in. And often there's a step that's missed when turf is reintroduced because they'll put sod down and they don't put any type of compost or anything under it and they'll just stick it right on top of the clay. So then you're left with nothing but clay, which is the subsoil rather than something that has organic matter in it. If that's the case, and that is mostly the case for most developed areas, you want to keep adding compost. Keep adding compost. Like every year, add an inch of compost, rake it in, and that does help to support adding organic matter. Mulching helps to add organic matter. So it's just like, you have to support the soil. I hopefully kind of addressed that question. Okay.
When you say well-established.
Mm-hmm. So established plants, that means that, so, okay, let me repeat the question. What does well-established mean when we're referring to perennials? So this is not just native plants, but also just perennials, plants that come back every year. They need time to put their roots down into the ground and get comfortable before they put their energy into becoming a big plant. And so that usually takes 3 to 4 years for them to do.
What do you do about really bad grasses like wiregrass,
yeah.
grass, and Bermuda?
What do we do about really bad grasses like wiregrass, crabgrass, and Bermuda grass? Set it on fire. No, I'm just kidding. Don't do that. So most of those grasses smother really, really well. Most turf grasses, like they're not going down like more than an inch when you're talking about the root level of turf grasses. They're really not there or good to prevent soil erosion. They really don't do much. Now, crabgrass, that's a whole nother story. No, I'm sorry. Bermuda grass is another story. So Bermuda grass has a rhizome that it's a long, thick root, and it just kind of stretches itself all over the place. Anytime I go somewhere and I see this, I'm just like, oh man, this is going to be a nightmare. It's a mess, and it does not smother well. If you have a yard full of Bermuda grass, it takes about 4 or 5 months to smother. When you take the plastic off, you're going to see some that are like bright green that are still trying to make it, but it will it will kill them off for the most part, but those seeds are still going to be in the ground. So that's something to be aware of. You just got to keep taking it out. The more you can weaken this plant, the better.
Do one more from the chat. If you want to
Okay. When waiting for the small plants to get larger, what are you using for ground cover? Straw, shredded hardwood mulch, or something else? And do you use small potted plants to help hide the gaps? Okay. All right. So it depends on the type of garden that you have. So like if you're doing like a full sun garden where you have mostly meadow plants or something like that, then you don't really want to fill that in with other plantings because your meadow plants are going to get pretty aggressive. So a hardwood shredded mulch is probably the most useful. I would not suggest straw because straw often has stuff in it. That stuff could be weed seeds or it could be chemicals, stuff like that have come off of turf grasses. So I wouldn't exactly use that. But shredded hardwood mulch, if you're doing that, you're usually putting it in at a 3-inch thickness. Do you use small? Okay. So you can. I wouldn't suggest putting in a bunch of plants in a space where like if your plant is going to get 2 feet wide and it's currently a quart-sized plant, leave it space to grow. Don't put too much competition around it. Like allow it to grow. But if you're really anxious for something there, you could put some annuals there or something that are not self-seeding all over the place. Should I take the mic to her? Do you want to be famous? Okay. Okay. We just yank it out. We yank it out. And you keep at it. And sometimes, so I will tell you that in the example that we gave you on Creeping Charlie, we didn't have to keep doing it. We went in there aggressively and removing it one time. And then after we mulched it, we didn't have too much coming up after that. But you got to kind of get in there and get all of it. And fortunately enough, it's mostly spreading above the ground and not really below the ground as much. So it's not the hardest to get rid of. It's just annoying because it spreads so quickly by seed that a whole bunch of them pop up at one time, and you're just like, oh, what is this nightmare? You know? Nice. Okay, yeah. Hmm. That's true. Okay, so the question is over a septic field, basically, what kind of plants do we put in? Um, you have to gear away from woodies. You can't put woody plants in that area, but you could do some plants that are like Ericaceae family, the blueberries, stuff like that, because like they're not going to put in deep roots. They're always going to kind of stay shallow. But most of our shrubs and trees are definitely going to put really deep roots in. Meadow as well, but typically herbaceous plants are not going to disrupt a, a septic area. There's always like that one plant that breaks the rule. So it's more about like doing your research on the plant, but typically a meadow isn't a bad thing in a septic field.
Yeah, I saw those two come pop up over here. I have a very large willow oak with exposed roots. Want to plant native ground cover.
Okay, so the question is about willow oaks, and basically what to plant around them. So willow oaks tend to be in areas that are more medium moisture to like higher water table. So you're really going for kind of like ground covers from the coastal area. A good like a good place to go with that is like a rule of thumb, maybe like you could go ferns because most ferns want some moisture, and so they might hang out together pretty well. But also checking DCR's list. DCR has a list of plant communities, natural communities, and it can tell you what plants occur together. And that's really helpful because you can figure out what area you're in and what's represented within your area.
Could bulbs work to fill gaps until perennials get established? Or will they have to?
What kind of bulb, you know? Okay, so the question was, could bulbs work to fill gaps until perennials get established, or will they compete with the natives? It really just depends on the type of bulb that you're putting in, okay? Like if you're throwing in daffodils, please don't do that, by the way. If you're throwing in daffodils, yeah, the daffodil's taken over. Like the daffodil's gonna win. So what I would suggest instead of doing bulbs per se is to do spring ephemerals. So spring ephemerals, these are native plants that come up like during the time of which like kind of March through April, where the leaves haven't come out yet, and they're taking advantage of that softer light. And then once the leaves are in, they're like, all right, I'm out of here. And they disappear right back into the ground. A good example of that would be like bluebells, right? So those are really great for filling in the area. And also, they're a good indication that spring is on its way and you don't have to be depressed anymore about the winter. It's okay.
How do you give trail birding grass to
Yeah. So, okay. So the question is basically, in a nutshell, um, when we're establishing a meadow and we have neighbors around, uh, how can we do that without it looking like without the neighbors thinking it's a mess, right? I would say a big portion of that has to do with where it's located. Because if you're doing it like in the front yard, then your neighbors are automatically going to say something. They're going to make some type of comment. And the best you can do is just say, hey, it's going to be really great, you know? Um, but it, like in the backyard or something like that, it's a lot easier to establish a meadow because meadows are messy in a sense. Meadows are messy. If you think about it, these are the successional areas where like the forest fires come in and knocked out the trees, and now we're getting a whole bunch of sunlight, and then the herbaceous plants are coming up, right? And they're covering the ground. They're playing a part. Meadows are typically not always meadows. Usually it's constantly changing. But in our landscapes, we just have like one type of landscape that's not really changing as much. So I would choose species that are particularly showy. And what you could do is, for example, meadows are really expensive to install if you're like plugging the whole thing, you know, if you're planting plants. What you could do is plug borders of plantings that are really solid. So it's obvious like that this is what it's going to be, that I'm doing this on purpose. And so, for example, Coreopsis, Zizia, Aurea, things like this, like you can put those as borders. And so it's though they can make a really solid line around, and then you can seed in the middle or something like that. But it's mostly about the communication of what it's going to turn into be. But I wouldn't suggest that necessarily for your front yard if your neighbors aren't down. Okay. Okay, so sum up of your question. So basically, what are the growing habits of white clover, right? So white clover, also called Dutch clover, also called deer clover, I think. Um, it depends. So how clover grows depends upon the environment that it's in. So clover tends to like the ground to be moist and for the temperatures to be cool. So if it's an area that's getting a whole lot of sun, you're going to have to keep seeding to keep it going, because easily crabgrass will take over clover if it's like full sun. They don't like it that much, but you can establish clover pretty easily throwing it over turf grasses because it kind of like puts itself in between the grasses. But if you've seeded it, there's going to be a whole lot of it coming up. Clover is really easy to train too. So like when it first comes up, it might want to get about like even like a foot and a half tall. If you just go ahead and mow it one time, that's usually all it takes, and it'll start growing lower the way that you want it to. But in the reason I say I really like clover is because pretty much everything wants to eat it, and there's a lot of insects that will host on it. I don't look at it as something that's negative.
It's not a question. If you on one of your first slides, but another way to
Yes.
if your dog has got wildlife habitat certified with the National Wildlife Federation, find it wildlife habitat. So that's another.
Okay. So the comment is about getting wildlife certifications, that so you have like a official sign in your yard that says, you know, this is for wildlife. Okay, so here's the thing. It depends on your neighborhood. Some of your neighbors do not care about that at all. You know what I mean? It just depends on the attitude of the neighborhood. So like if you're in this cookie cutter neighborhood where everything is like perfect grass, they're probably not going to love that. You know what I mean? So it just really depends. And sometimes it takes you being the advocate for native plants in your neighborhood to be like, this is a good thing, and you can encourage other people to do it. But it's all about the approach. So if it's super too wild in an area that's really, really tidy, you're probably going to have some pushback on that. You know, it just depends. But signage is a good thing.